Now, Martin, let's reaffirm our salt of the earth, men of the people credentials by talking about the quality of service on the Eurostar.
Yeah, so this is a sore point for me because I've literally this week just lost my carte blanche status on the Eurostar. So I used to have to travel on the Eurostar quite a lot for work, like at least once a month, sometimes twice a month. I worked my way up from the bottom, James. I went on journey after journey. I managed to secure that golden card, the magic ticket that allows me to completely bypass security, have free food on the train as well, and as many of those little glass bottles of red wine as I can possibly drink on one train journey without causing a public scene. It was fantastic, James, and unfortunately it's all been taken away from me. But I assume we're not doing the podcast about that injustice. Is there something else going on?
I was going to say, we've done quite enough of your personal grievances on this podcast, Martin. No, there was another problem with the Eurostar, and that's not just the service on board. The problem is that Eurostar itself has been retracting. So, not so long ago, it was actually possible to catch a Eurostar train, not just from St Pancras in London, where you can now, but also Ebbsfleet and Ashford International in Kent on the high-speed one line, and take the train all the way from Kent to various destinations in France. But then, the pandemic hit, services were cut, and nothing has happened since. There are still no trains from Kent on Eurostar since the pandemic.
Yeah, and that's like 5 years now, so which is a pretty long time.
Yeah, it's pretty strange, I think, that there are still no plans to bring back services after so long. It's not like we're still wearing masks and making sourdough and so on. I think the latest thing Eurostar has said is that the position will be, quote, reviewed in 2026, which sounds a bit like when, I used to ask my parents if we could go to McDonald's on the way home from the shops. And my dad would say, we'll see. And I, knowing full well that the answer was actually no, they're not going to do that. So I think Eurostar are probably saying more or less the same thing.
So what's the reason for that? Why have they not brought it back, and why are they not even discussing bringing it back?
So the reason they stopped, I think, is pretty understandable. During the pandemic, no one was taking the train, so there was literally no case for even a skeleton service from either of these stations. I think they only got sort of like 1 or 2 trains a day because, St Pancras still got the bulk of them. But the reasons they haven't picked them up again is because of the thing that nobody wants to talk about, and the elephant in the room in a lot of the growth discussion is Brexit. So next year, the EU is finally going to introduce its entry-exit system, EES. So when you go to Europe, and if you're British, you'll have to, it'll be like going to America or something. You'll have to get the fingerprints scanned, answer a bunch of questions, and that sort of thing. And that all basically adds, precious seconds to the processing time at passport control. And it requires new equipment, staff training, big new queues to manage, basically a load of faff, which is why Eurostar have said they're concentrating on St Pancras for the time being.
And if this never used to concern me, I knew it was coming in, but as mentioned, I had carte blanche status, so I just skipped the queue anyway. But now I'm no longer one of the Eurostar elite. Now I'm basically one of the plebeian masses like you, James. And that means it might affect me personally, which is really bad. But I guess it's also bad for other people, and in particular for growth and for the wider economy, right? I mean, every week, pretty much, we talk about HS2 because we're legally obliged to by our contracts, and also because it's so important for connecting places and creating economic growth. And this feels like another example, essentially a high-speed railway line that we have, but we're not getting the most out of.
Absolutely, and that's why I wanted to talk about Eurostar this week. So earlier this week, the think tank, the Good Growth Foundation, they actually put out a new paper called Light at the End of the Tunnel. You can see what they did there. And they're basically arguing that we should reopen at least the Ashford connection, because they point out in this report, and the numbers are quite sort of shocking, I think, that we've got £80 million worth of infrastructure basically going to rot. And this cancellation of all the international trains from Kent, it's caused a loss of footfall, it's hurt local businesses. And according to the way they've modelled this, and you can read the full methodology in their report that we'll link to on abundancepod.com, if Ashford alone was to reopen, they reckon it could add around sort of £536 million to the British economy, or 2.7 billion over 5 years. And by a conservative estimate, they reckon it could bring in an extra 197,000 new visitors just to Ashford, if you ever thought about visiting there. And they've even got a more optimistic estimate. They reckon it could be as many as 493,000 extra people visiting Ashford and spending money in its environs.
I mean, imagine that 500,000 French people coming to Ashford to see the site. I suppose there's like Leeds Castle. There's the weird pirate caves at Margate, the vineyards. French people like vineyards, don't they? There's quite a few of those in Kent.
Yeah, there's definitely lots to see in Kent. I think Ramsgate a massively underrated day out, but yeah, I suspect business connections are also a big part of it. And this is important, right? Because, though we think of Kent as the southeast and therefore like the richest part of the country, there are still significant parts of Kent which are really quite deprived, both around Ashford and also in North Kent near Ebbsfleet. And they would obviously benefit from all of the extra jobs and the trade. That's why that's why we like building things, and that's how we grow the economy. And the reason this is an obvious thing we should do is, like you say, that's why we build railway lines. And we don't even need to persuade the government to build a new railway line in this case. We just have to make them, use the one we've already got. It's already sat there. And more broadly, I think, this is just frankly a really embarrassing state of affairs, because now Britain has at least 3 international train stations that don't have any international trains. So there's Ashford and Ebbsfleet, and there's also Stratford International in East London. That's never had any international trains. It's just sat there waiting to be used. And you've got this amazing bit of engineering, the Channel Tunnel, a genuine, incredible human achievement, and we're not using it to full capacity.
Yeah, it's incredible. I always think back to the 1800s when they were first thinking of doing a channel tunnel. In fact, I think it was even earlier than that. And imagine telling someone from that era, like, yep, we've done it. We've dug the tunnel. We've got it all the way to Calais, which is French now, by the way. And we've got train tracks through it. And there's high-speed trains that can do 200 miles an hour. And we've attached one railway station to it. Like, they think we were absolutely bonkers. And they'd be worried about the French invading, because that was actually a real concern when they were first considering a channel tunnel, was what if Napoleon comes through?
Exactly, Martin, and that's why reopening the Eurostar and forcing them to reopen these stations seems like such a no-brainer to me. The defence risk is very low, and the economic upside could be huge. And I just think the government should use the powers of, being the government to try and make this happen.
We'll never underestimate the French, James. But I assume this would cost hundreds of millions of pounds, right? Getting all this running again?
So according to the Good Growth Foundation's estimate, they reckon that reopening just Ashford would take a capital investment of between 2 and 3.5 million pounds. And the ongoing staffing cost would be 1.15 to 1.4 million pounds, something in that ballpark. Now, Martin, I'm not an economist, but looking at those numbers, I think that's basically approximately bugger all. I mean, certainly if you're a treasury, that's basically nothing. It could be a huge investment in the Kent economy for not that much cash.
Yeah, I mean, I have my calculator here, and that is basically enough to fund the NHS for about 13 minutes, I think, give or take. So we're not talking big numbers.
So this is obviously a no-brainer, and this is the last thing I want to say is there is potentially some good news here in that soon Eurostar's monopoly might be broken. So even if Eurostar don't revive these cross-channel rail services, maybe a bunch of other companies might do soon too, because it's like an open access thing where any company can theoretically pay and run trains. So, for example, Virgin, Richard Branson, he's trying to launch some rail services, and then separately a Spanish company called Evelyn. They're working with the Italian state train company now, I think. They're trying to do like London to Paris journeys. The most interesting one, though, I think, is a company called Gemini, which has said that if it launches its rail services, it will actually try and stop at Ebbsfleet and Ashford. And the company do seem pretty serious. They've just recently done a deal with Uber, so I guess you'll be going onto the Uber app to buy your tickets there. So, yeah, maybe that could lead to the reopening of Ebbsfleet and Ashford, and everyone could be happy.
And that sounds great, James. You can book your train ticket and then you can watch for 20 minutes while the train goes in the opposite direction. You decide whether or not to cancel your ticket or not. I'm not entirely sure I'm convinced by Uber for trains, James, but, it's all innovation, I guess.
I don't know about trains going in the wrong direction, but there could be delays. So even if this happens, the earliest possible time train services could resume is 2029, which will be 9 years after the pandemic.
So why is it going to take so long, James? I mean, 2029 isn't as bad as it could be compared to a lot of the things we talk about on this podcast, but it still seems quite slow.
Yeah, I'll still be well into my 40s at that point, so I'm trying not to think about what's going to be going on there. So there's 2 big holdups. So basically, one of the problems is something we talk about a lot on this podcast. There's some bureaucratic faffing around. So there's a train depot at Temple Mills in Stratford. It's currently the Eurostar depot. It's where, if you operate trains on the Channel Tunnel, you would want to have your trains housed overnight where you want to do maintenance and stuff. According to one independent review, there's only room for one other train operator there. So all of these new companies are trying to fight fight and argue and say, well, we want that extra space for our trains to go in there. And then exactly who will get to go in there, that decision needs to be made by the Office of Road and Rail, which is the government regulator. And they're going to make a decision, I think, by the end of October. So that's the bit of paperwork that will need to happen.
So potentially the politicians could actually move some of these things along a bit, right? They could help out with the bureaucracy.
Yeah, a little bit. But then this is what's sort of annoying, Martin, because obviously I went into this story thinking, well, here I am. I'm going to expose another thing the government could do, a just decision they could make, a signature they could put on a document to speed things up and we'd be away. But it turns out that launching a new train company is actually quite difficult because even if one of these companies gets access to Temple Mills and gets all the paperwork in order, well, then you then need to commission and pay for and build a whole set of trains and wait for them to be delivered. And it turns out building a train takes quite a long time.
Wow. So if any of our listeners happen to have some trains lying around that we could use, let us know. We'll hook you up with the relevant people and maybe we can get this thing unlocked. And also, if anyone happens to be listening from Eurostar and they could restore my carte blanche status, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.